What happened to Shaman King? It's one of the most popular manga out there, and somehow it's completely irrelevant. It went from one of Shonen Jump's biggest manga in the early 2000s to a series that you hardly find anyone talking about. With a gorgeous art style and a unique premise, it's hard to imagine how any of this happened. That is, until you look at either of its anime adaptations or bother to read the manga ending. So having just binged all of the omnibus volumes for the very first time, I'd like to share my impression of the series, go a bit in depth into what drove this manga into obscurity, and discuss whether or not it's still worth reading. Now obviously when we're talking Shaman King, a big reason a lot of people decide to check it out is because of the art style. It's probably the best part of the series. I tell this story all the time, but my first experience with Shaman King was walking into my local comic book store, turning to the omnibus volumes and just staring at them like, God damn, these covers are gorgeous. The early stuff is a lot different from the style Shaman King would become famous for later on, but no matter where you look in the manga, Shaman King is a story that always looks unique. I won't go too in depth only because I already did so in my last video, but having just finished the whole manga, one of my big takeaways is that this is the epitome of early 2000s manga, aesthetically that is. Especially in the earlier volumes, you could pick up this manga out of context, and instantly recognize that it came after the big wave of manga in the 80s and early 90s, and right before the next wave that would come in the mid to late 2000s. The character designs are over the top but refined at the same time, making Shaman King one of the most instantly recognizable manga to this day. And this was only made better by the fact that Shaman King actually had a good story. Say what you will about the ending, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes, but the early Shaman King binge was one of my favorite manga binges ever. But before I explain why that is, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So when I say Shaman King is the epitome of 2000s manga, I'm mostly referring to how it looks. But this can also be said for much of the early story. The story follows Yo, a young teenager who can talk to and control spirits thanks to his training as a shaman. With the help of his friend Manta and his fiancée Anna, Yo must enter a tournament of shamans in order to become the Shaman King. Just from the premise alone, you can tell how Shaman King shares a lot in common with stories like One Piece and Naruto. But part of why people fall in love with Shaman King early on is because it's so different. Instead of the typical ambitious main character, Yo would be perfectly content sitting outside and listening to music. Instead of the usual female stereotype that's helpless or has to prove something, Anna is a relentless character that at times is probably more of a badass than Yo. And Manta, well, he's just double-cheeked up, except instead of a Thursday afternoon, it's every chapter. There's a bunch of other great characters like Tao Ren, the jaded character that controls a Chinese warlord, Horo Horo, the Ainu character that replaces the 2000 skateboard with his signature snowboard, and then there's Ryu, who is basically all of your favorite delinquent characters jammed into one. Some of these characters stand out more than others, but the chemistry between them is amazing and it makes early Shaman King really fun to read, especially when they all team up in the Shaman King tournament and travel across America to iconic destinations like Route 66. The story borrows things we all recognize like Route 66 to make the world feel real, and blends all of that with its signature art style and wacky characters to present a kind of story that's one of a kind. That is, until you get about halfway through the story. So as the characters travel across America, they eventually reach the actual location of the Shaman King tournament. And at first, it's really cool. You get cool fights, new powers and transformations, a bunch of new characters. But in between the actual tournament, there's all these fights that take place in between rounds to move the plot forward. And they're also pretty cool, but at some point you just hit this wall where you've read a dozen of these fights back to back to back with no real rest in between, and you're just like, where is this going? And from this point, the story hits several major obstacles. Incidentally, this is around the same time the manga starts to lose popularity in Weekly Shonen Jump. So you add the decline in story quality and the decline in popularity, and this culminates into Shaman King coming to an abrupt end in 2004. Abrupt as in the story just ends out of nowhere and none of the big questions really get answered. The manga would end with chapter 285, or Chapter 286 as it would become after later alterations to the story. This meant that Shaman King initially ended with Volume 32 being its last volume. So for a time, getting into the manga was kinda tricky, because obviously the early stuff is really good, but it kinda spirals downwards later on, and at this point, there was really no ending to the story. So it was like, should I really spend all that time reading the manga? Well, maybe instead of reading the manga, you might decide to watch the anime. Except the anime has its own problems.
I'm a bit of a problem! Yes, you're right, I am!
So Shaman King was serialized in '98. It would then get an anime adaptation in 2001 that was animated by Studio Sebek and produced by TV Tokyo. I personally haven't watched it yet, but for older shows I've heard it's pretty good. Unfortunately, the anime only ran for like a year or so, ending with 64 episodes in 2002. Now, if you paid attention, you'd know that the manga didn't end until 2004. Naturally, as you might imagine, this led to several deviations from the canon story, with the anime having to come up with its own ending. And now you can kinda see how Shaman King fell into obscurity. It had an anime that only ran for about a year with its own original ending. While it would see moderate success in its initial run, its short lifespan and the abrupt ending of the manga kinda killed any chance of the anime eventually blowing up on a global scale. The anime would later be released in English on 4Kids, which is where a lot of people would likely come to form a sense of nostalgia for the series. But by then it was 2003 and the manga would end just a year later. So you combine all of these factors, the writing, the ending, the anime, and it kinda makes sense why Shaman King has never really been as popular as other series like One Piece. Which is kind of tragic in a way, because Takei and Oda were both assistants on Rurouni Kenshin, so it's sad to see how their careers went in two very different paths. But now, 2 decades later, there's still a small yet dedicated fanbase in the West. As far as I understand, the series is still fairly popular with Japanese fans. So at this point in 2024, you see people who still love the manga. You have KODANSHA releasing the manga in omnibus volumes, and you even have a new anime adaptation. So if you see that and you find out about all of this other stuff that happened before, it makes it hard to decide whether it's really worth getting into. If you are one of those people and you're not quite sure, or if you're a die-hard fan and you'd like to hear a fresh perspective, allow me to explain the great parts of Shaman King and the not-so-great parts. So first of all, let me just start off by saying you shouldn't start with the new anime. I've been told it has at least one pretty major spoiler, so you'd kinda be ruining it for yourself. Plus, although it's mostly faithful to the canon story, it allegedly ran on a limited budget and is just kinda so-so. If anything, the anime is just something there for people who are already fans who just want a decent anime. Now, as far as the manga goes, allow me to explain what I think are its weaknesses. First of all, I don't really like the fights. While some of the fights really stand out, I think fights are kind of boring in Shaman King. The paneling is fairly conventional in the beginning, and while it does improve later on, it never really contributes all that much. I'm just not crazy about how the fights are structured. It's a lot of the characters just showing off big attacks and clashing, and not a whole lot in between. Which is cool, but it gets pretty boring when it's back to back to back. Especially as you get later into the story and what used to actually be spirits quickly evolves into flying mechs. I also think the pacing is kind of a mess. Like, there will be parts of the story that feel fully fleshed out, and then there will be parts that end as fast as they start. Probably my least favorite part of the story is right around the midway point when we get the fight for the golem. I just remember skimming through these chapters because you had the cast fighting against the witches for some reason and just all of these pointless fights. And then we suddenly care about this golem and these two kids who up until now have been completely irrelevant side characters. Takei makes it so that they're tied into the plot, but the whole time I'm just like, what does any of this have to do with Yo and being the Shaman King? Which brings me to my next point. While I think characters are one of Shaman King's biggest appeals, they are seriously held back by a clear lack of proper planning. All of the main characters have solid growth early on. Ryu goes from being a basic moron to being a pretty chill dude. Ren also chills out and learns to balance his ambitions. Horo almost has the opposite arc as he starts out as a really goofy character and gets pretty serious by the end. You also have Joko, who I didn't mention before. He's a decent character, but his arc gets tied into the whole golem deal, and after that he doesn't really change that more as a character, so he's not exactly in my top characters. And then you have Lyserg, who, I'm gonna be honest, I never really liked. I think he is the most boring of the main cast, and it is my personal belief that he adds practically nothing to the story. I think his character is lame, I think his powers are lame, and he basically contributes nothing to the dynamic of the main characters.
His hair, whack. His ears, whack. His jewelry, whack.
He is one of the many examples where I think Takei just made a ton of characters at first and decided he would figure out what to do with them later. I think this is true for a lot of the villains, I think it's true for the Gandara characters, and I think it's especially true for the X-Laws. They all start out fairly unique, but you quickly notice that all they ever get is new powers, and rarely do you ever see them change as characters. It is a huge reason why Shaman King starts to fall off towards the end, as it focuses on fights, which were never its big appeal in the first place, and neglects what made fans fall in love with the story in the first place. Which is kind of ironic because you look at a lot of manga and you see how they just make up one arc after another. Yet in Shaman King, it always works towards the same endgame, defeating the main villain and winning the Shaman King tournament. So it's in this weird purgatory of having a foundation that stays consistent, yet building on that with a plot that goes all over the place. But despite all that, I still think Shaman King is worth reading. As sad as the later part of the story is to watch, early Shaman King has to be one of my favorite experiences in manga. It's got all of these funky designs and abilities, it's got a ton of cool characters from different places around the world. I can't state enough just how much I love the inclusion of Ainu culture. Also, Silva and the Patch Tribe. Like, how many manga do you know that make Native American myths and culture a major part of the story? And even ignoring that, Silva is one of the best characters in the story. That is, until they assassinate his character later, but we don't talk about that. And of course, the art of Shaman King is absolutely gorgeous. Again, I talk about this more in my other video, but words do this art style no justice. It doesn't exactly reinvent the wheel, but above all else, Takei has an art style that will always be amazing to look at. And that's kinda where I'm at with Shaman King. I think it's clear that Takei kinda lost his way as the story entered its second half. But with a unique premise and iconic art style, it's worth reading the first few arcs just to see why people eventually fall in love with this manga despite its flaws. There are a lot of urban legends about this series and its downfall, so let me just make one thing clear. While it was unlucky to get the pressure it did from Shueisha leading up to its abrupt ending, this wasn't totally undeserved. Even Takei admits that he kinda started drawing for himself and forgot about readers. Even so, Shaman King is a series full of personality that still has a small but very dedicated fanbase. So if you love the art and are curious to check out what makes the story so charming, I cannot recommend Shaman King enough. But what do you think? What do you like about Shaman King? What are some of your critiques? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out that video I mentioned on Shaman King's art. In that video, I explained Shaman King's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.